Aelith had not set foot in Ashenmere in 5 years. She had planned to keep it that way for the rest of her natural life. But plans, as she had learned at great personal cost, meant nothing when a 4-year-old boy decided to sprout fur and fangs at a border checkpoint and bite the patrol captain hard enough to draw blood. "Get him off me!" the captain bellowed, shaking his arm with the frantic energy of a man who had not expected his morning to go quite this badly. Emrys released his grip and dropped to the ground. The shift melted off him in a clumsy tumble of shrinking limbs and two big gray eyes, leaving a small, shivering boy standing in the dirt with nothing but the cold air around him, looking up at his mother with an expression of absolute triumph. "Mama," he whispered, "I did it." Aelith's chest cracked open with pride and terror in equal measure. She pulled off her traveling cloak and wrapped it around his small body, lifting him onto her hip in one practiced motion. His arms locked around her neck immediately. His heartbeat hammered against her collarbone like a trapped bird. "You did," she murmured into his hair, "and your timing is spectacular." Because timing was everything. And this was the worst timing in the recorded history of terrible decisions. They were supposed to be passing through, skirting the border, staying invisible. She had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being no one, keeping her head down and her son hidden in a village, so small it did not appear on any map. 5 years of teaching Emrys to keep his wolf locked tight, to never let anyone see what lived beneath his skin. And all it had taken was one overzealous guard grabbing her arm too roughly and her boy's protective instincts igniting for the very first time. The soldiers had stopped moving. 8 of them stood in a loose half-circle, and every single one was staring at her son with the same frozen expression, not at his face, at the memory of his wolf. A pup's coat should have been unremarkable, soft brown or dull gray, the generic coloring of a young wolf yet to grow into his lineage. But Emrys had shifted into something unmistakable. Fur the color of black iron, a silver slash across the chest, the dark ridge running the full length of his spine. Ashenmere Alpha bloodline markers, markers that belonged to one family and one family alone. Markers that belonged to the man who had stood before the entire pack 5 years ago and declared his Luna barren, defective, and unfit to carry his name. The captain cradled his bitten forearm and looked at Aelith. Really looked at her. She watched recognition arrive behind his eyes like a slow tide rolling in. 5 years had changed her. She was leaner, harder, her hair longer, and her jaw set in the permanent way of a woman who had learned to carry everything alone. But the bones of her face were the same. The amber of her eyes was the same. "You are Aelith Sorvain," the captain said. "Not a question." "That name was taken from me." Her voice came out flat and steady. "I go by Aelith of Dunmere. Dunmere has no pack. I am aware." The captain's gaze dropped to Emrys, to the dark curls, black as ink, to the eyes, storm gray, the exact shade that stared out from every portrait in the great hall of Ashenmere Keep, to the shape of his jaw, still soft with childhood but already carrying the architecture of his father's face. "That boy," the captain started, "is mine." Aelith's voice was quiet and precise, filed to a killing edge. "He is mine, and we are passing through." The captain shook his head slowly. The pity in his expression frightened her more than anger ever could have. "A rider left the moment your son shifted. Word is already traveling to the keep." The ground tilted beneath her feet. Aelith tightened her grip on Emrys and felt his small fingers curl into her collar. 5 years of silence. 5 years of building a life from nothing in a place nobody had ever heard of. Working as an herbalist, delivering babies, mending bones, raising her boy in the warm, anonymous dark. And now a single moment of instinct had torn the whole thing open. "How long before the rider reaches the keep?" she asked, keeping her voice level through nothing but sheer, practiced will. "Less than an hour." Emrys lifted his head from her shoulder. "Mama, why is everyone staring at us?" "They are admiring your cloak," Aelith said, without missing a beat. "But it is your cloak." "Exactly. I have excellent taste." The ghost of a smile crossed the captain's face before discipline killed it. You will wait here. An escort will be sent. They came within the hour. 6 mounted soldiers in formal Ashenmere gray, led by a woman whose face Aelith did not recognize. The ride to the keep consumed the rest of the daylight. Emrys fell asleep against her chest somewhere along the forest road, his breathing deep and trusting in a way that made her throat ache so fiercely she had to look at the trees to keep herself steady. The forest thinned. Ashenmere Keep rose against the evening sky like a scar in the landscape. Stone walls she had once called home. The high tower where she had watched storms roll in across the valley. The courtyard where she had been stripped of her name in front of 300 wolves who would not meet her eyes. She remembered every second of that day. Torvain's face carved from granite, his voice flat and final as he read the council's decree. The silence of the crowd. Not one voice raised in her defense. Not one hand extended to stop what was happening. She had walked out of those gates with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she was walking back and carrying everything. The great doors groaned open. Firelight spilled across the threshold like a wound. The hall was full. Of course it was full. News traveled fast in a pack this size. And the arrival of the exiled Luna with a pup bearing alpha bloodline markers was exactly the kind of news that filled a hall to its stone walls. Hundreds of eyes found her at once. The murmuring died as if someone had pressed a hand over the mouth of every person in the room. Aelith kept her spine straight and her grip on Emrys steady. He stood at the far end of the hall. Torvain. 5 years had not diminished him. He was still the tallest man in any room, still broad-shouldered and dark-haired, still carrying himself with the weight of a man who had never once questioned whether the ground would hold beneath him. But something had changed. The hollows beneath his eyes were deeper than she remembered. The hard line of his mouth seemed carved into his face rather than chosen. And those storm-gray eyes, the ones her son wore like stolen property, locked onto her with an expression she had never seen him wear in all their years together. Not anger, not authority, not the cold, immovable certainty she remembered from the morning he had cast her out. Something raw, something that looked almost like fear. Emrys stirred in her arms, blinking awake. He looked up at the enormous man at the far end of the hall, then back at his mother, then back at Torvain, his small brow furrowed. "Mama," he said, loud enough for every wolf in the hall to hear with devastating clarity, "that man has my face." The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the hall cracked open. Voices erupted in every direction, overlapping and crashing against the stone walls like waves hitting a breakwater. Council members shot to their feet. Soldiers stepped forward, then stopped, uncertain whether this was a threat or a miracle. An older woman near the front pressed both hands to her mouth and let out a sound that could have been a gasp or a prayer. Aelith stood perfectly still in the center of it all. Emrys clutched to her chest and let the chaos wash over her like weather. She had been expecting this. She had been dreading this for 5 years. And now that it was happening, she found a strange, cold calm settling into her bones. The worst had already happened to her once in this very room. Lightning did not frighten you after it had already struck. Torvain had not moved. He stood behind the long oak table at the head of the hall, one hand braced against its surface like he needed it to stay upright. His eyes had not left the boy, not once. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin even from this distance. Silence. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like an axe through wet wood. The hall obeyed instantly. 300 wolves went still. In the quiet, Emrys whispered, "Mama, that man is loud." "Yes," Aelith whispered back. "He has always been loud." Torvain stepped around the table. Each stride was measured, controlled, the walk of a man holding himself together through pure discipline. He stopped 10 feet away from her, close enough to see the shadows beneath his eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of cedar and iron that hit her like a fist to the sternum after 5 years of its absence. His gaze moved from the boy to her. Aelith. Her name came out rough, scraped raw, like he had not said it in a long time, and his mouth had forgotten the shape of it. "Alpha Torvain." She used his title deliberately, a wall, a reminder of what he was and what he had done and the distance those things had created between them. Something flickered across his face at the formality. Pain, maybe, or recognition that he deserved it. That child, he started, is not your concern. Aelith shifted Emrys higher on her hip. We were passing through your territory. Nothing more. A border guard overreacted. I am happy to leave and never trouble you again. A murmur rippled through the hall. She could feel the council members leaning forward, could feel the weight of 300 wolves recalculating the story they had been told 5 years ago. The Luna was barren. The Luna could not produce an heir. The Luna was sent away because the bloodline required continuation, and she could not provide it. And yet here she stood, holding a boy with black iron curls and storm-gray eyes, and the jaw of every alpha who had ever ruled Ashenmere. Torvain's gaze dropped to Emrys again. The boy stared back at him with open, fearless curiosity. Children were like that. They did not understand politics or exile or the weight of bloodline markers. They just saw a very tall man with a familiar face and wondered why. How old is he? Torvain asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. Aelith's grip tightened. She did not want to answer this question. She knew exactly what the arithmetic would reveal. 4 years and 7 months, she said. She watched him do the math. Watched the realization arrive like a crack spreading through ice. 4 years and 7 months. Which meant conceived at least 5 years ago. Which meant conceived before the exile. Which meant she had been pregnant when he cast her out. The color drained from Torvain's face. For one terrible, endless moment, the most powerful alpha in the territory looked like he had been run through with his own sword. You were, he started and could not finish. Passing through, Aelith repeated, her voice hard. That is all I came here to do. You cannot leave. This came not from Torvain, but from a tall, sharp-featured man standing at the alpha's right shoulder. Jorath, the beta. Aelith remembered him. He had been one of the few who had not looked away on the day she was exiled. He had watched the whole thing with an expression she could not read then and could not read now. The boy carries alpha bloodline markers. Jorath continued, his voice measured and deliberate. By pack law, his lineage must be formally verified before either of you can leave Ashenmere territory. This is not optional. Aelith felt the trap close around her. I did not consent to pack law when your alpha stripped me of my place in this pack. Pack law does not require your consent, Jorath replied without inflection. It requires your presence. You will be given quarters. The verification will be conducted tomorrow. Emrys tugged her collar. Mama, I am hungry. The entire hall seemed to inhale. Something about the smallness of the request, the pure ordinariness of a child asking for food in the middle of a political earthquake, seemed to crack through every adult in the room. Torvain made a sound low in his throat. He took another step forward, and Emrys turned to look at him with those devastating gray eyes. Stay back. Aelith's voice came out sharper than she intended. Torvain stopped immediately, and the flash of hurt that crossed his face almost made her feel guilty. Almost. Then she remembered the decree and the silent crowd and the long walk through the gates with nothing, and the almost evaporated like morning frost. Emrys, however, was not finished. He studied Torvain with the intense, unblinking focus that children reserve for things they find genuinely confusing. Then his small body went rigid in Aelith's arms. A low sound rumbled up through his chest. Not a whimper, not a cry. A growl. A 4-year-old boy was growling at the alpha of Ashenmere. And it was not a child's growl. It was deep, resonant, vibrating with a frequency that made every wolf in the hall flinch. Aelith felt it in her own bones, a thrum of power that should not have been possible from someone so small. The soldiers nearest them took an involuntary step backward. A council member knocked over his chair. Torvain stared at the boy with an expression of unguarded shock. Then Emrys's eyes flashed gold. Not amber, not hazel, not the warm glow of a juvenile wolf finding its footing. Pure, burning, sovereign gold. The eyes of a true alpha. The color that appeared once in a generation if the bloodline was lucky. He was 4 years old, and his wolf was already more powerful than anyone in this room had expected. Torvain looked at his son. His son looked back at him with golden eyes and bared teeth, protecting the only person in the world who had ever protected him. The hall had never been so quiet. They gave her a room in the east wing, not the guest quarters reserved for visiting dignitaries, which would have been a political statement, not the servants' quarters, which would have been an insult. The east wing was a careful, deliberate nothing, a room that said the council had not yet decided what she was. Aelith did not sleep. Emrys slept immediately, the way children do after days of upheaval, dropping into unconsciousness the moment his body hit the mattress. His dark curls spread across the pillow like spilled ink. His breathing was deep and even and impossibly trusting. He had no idea what was coming tomorrow. He had no concept of lineage verification or pack politics, or the fact that the tall man with the familiar face had once thrown his mother out like she was nothing. Aelith sat on the edge of the bed beside him, watching the firelight move across his face, and tried not to think about what she was going to do. A knock came before dawn. Soft, deliberate, not a soldier's knock. She opened the door to find Jorth standing in the corridor, dressed as though he had not slept either. His expression was unreadable in the dim light. "The healer will see the boy at first light," he said. "I wanted to inform you before the formal summons." Aelith studied him. "Inform me or gauge my reaction?" The faintest flicker of something crossed his face. Approval, perhaps. "Both," he admitted. She leaned against the doorframe. "What kind of test?" "A scent analysis and blood confirmation. Standard for any contested lineage claim. Healer Orla will conduct it." Orla. The name was unfamiliar. What happened to Veda? The pause that followed was a fraction too long. Healer Veda left Ashenmere 3 years ago. She relocated. No one has heard from her since. Something cold moved through Aelith's chest. Veda had been the pack healer who had examined her. Veda had been the one who had looked her in the eye and told the council, told Torvain, that the Luna was barren, that her body would never carry a child, that the bloodline would end with her unless the Alpha acted. Veda had been the one whose words had destroyed her life. And now Veda was gone. Vanished. 3 years without a word. "Convenient," Aelith said quietly. Joreth did not respond to that. "The test will take place in the healer's chamber. I will escort you myself." "How generous." "It is not generosity," Joreth replied. "It is practicality. There are factions in this pack who would prefer you never reach the healer's chamber at all." Aelith's blood went cold. "Someone wants to stop the test?" "Someone wants to stop the result." He met her gaze. "I suggest you let me walk you there." She did. The walk through the pre-dawn corridors of Ashenmere Keep felt like crossing a landscape she had once known intimately and now recognized only in fragments. A doorway here, a stone carving there, a window that caught the light at the exact angle she remembered from mornings she had spent a lifetime trying to forget. Emrys rode on her hip, half awake, his face buried in her neck. Healer Orla was waiting in a warm, cluttered room that smelled of dried sage and something sharper beneath it. She was a woman of perhaps 60, compact and efficient, with hands that moved with the brisk confidence of someone who had been solving problems since before most of the pack was born. "Set the child here," Orla said, patting the examination table. Aelith hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed against placing her son on a table in a room belonging to someone she did not know, in a territory that had already betrayed her once. "I will not hurt him," Orla said, reading her expression. "I have no interest in politics. I have interest in truth. There is a difference." Aelith set Emrys down carefully. The boy looked around the room with wide, curious eyes, examining the jars of dried herbs and the strange instruments on the shelves with the fearless fascination that made him both wonderful and exhausting. "What is that?" Emrys asked, pointing to a glass vial filled with something amber. "Tincture of wolfsbane," Orla replied. "Diluted. It helps with fevers." "What is that?" He pointed to another jar. "Ground moon petal. For pain." "What is that?" "That," Orla said, taking his small hand and gently pressing her thumb to his wrist, "is a question you can ask me later." She worked quickly and quietly. A drop of blood from his fingertip, which Emrys bore with stoic silence, and then immediately demanded a sweet for his bravery. A series of scent checks, Orla passing her hand slowly above his skin, her nostrils flaring as she catalogued what only a trained healer's nose could detect. And then a long, very still moment where she simply held his hand and closed her eyes. Emrys looked at Aelith. "Mama, she is smelling me." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you are very interesting," Aelith said. Orla opened her eyes. She looked at Emrys, then at Aelith, then at Jorath, who stood motionless by the door. "The blood is confirmed," Orla said. Her voice was flat, clinical, stripped of any emotion. "This child is a direct line descendant of the Ashenmere Alpha bloodline, paternal match to Torvan Ashenmere." Jorath exhaled slowly. Aelith felt her hands begin to shake and pressed them flat against her thighs. "There is something else," Orla continued, and her voice shifted. The clinical detachment cracked, and beneath it was something Aelith did not expect: alarm. "The boy's blood carries markers I have not seen in any living wolf." Orla picked up the glass slide where Emrys's blood sample sat and held it up to the candlelight. "His alpha markers are dominant, fully expressed. This is not typical for a child his age. Most pups do not present dominant markers until puberty at the earliest." "What does that mean?" Aelith asked, though her gut was already twisting. "It means his wolf is exceptionally powerful. Generationally powerful." Orla set the slide down and looked at Aelith with an expression that was no longer clinical at all. "But there is something else in the blood work that concerns me more." Aelith went very still. "What?" Orla glanced at Jorath, then back at Aelith. She seemed to weigh something carefully before speaking. "I have examined the old records, Healer Veda's files, her notes from your examination 5 years ago." She paused. The diagnosis of barrenness was based on a hormonal panel that Veda claimed showed irreversible reproductive failure. Aelith's heart was pounding. "Claimed?" Orla reached for a leather-bound folder on her shelf and opened it to a page marked with a thin red ribbon. "I re-examined those records when I took over Veda's position 3 years ago. The hormonal readings she documented are inconsistent with barrenness. They are, however, entirely consistent with a woman whose fertility had been chemically suppressed." The room tilted. Aelith gripped the edge of the examination table with both hands. "Suppressed," she repeated, and the word came out in a whisper. "Deliberately," Orla said, "over a sustained period, likely months. The compound she used leaves a specific signature in the hormonal record, and it is there in Veda's own notes, documented but mislabeled. Either she was incompetent, or she did not expect anyone to look closely enough to notice." Jorath stepped forward. "You are saying the Luna was never barren?" "I am saying," Orla replied, meeting his gaze, "that someone made certain she would appear to be." Emrys tugged at Aelith's sleeve. "Mama, can I have my sweet now?" But Aelith could not speak. She was staring at the healer's records, at the evidence of the lie that had cost her everything. And the room was spinning around her, and the only solid thing in the world was the small, warm hand pulling at her sleeve. Somewhere in the keep above them, the Alpha of Ashenmere was about to learn that he had exiled his mate, the mother of his only child, his true Luna, based on a lie. And Aelith had no idea whether that truth would save her or destroy her all over again. The summons came before midday. Aelith was still in the healer's chamber, still holding Emrys on her lap, still trying to process the words that had just dismantled 5 years of her understanding, when Jorath appeared in the doorway. "The Alpha has been informed," he said. "He requests your presence in the council room." "Requests," Aelith repeated flatly. Jorath had the decency not to pretend. "He requests it very strongly." Emrys had found a jar of dried chamomile on Orla's shelf and was methodically sorting the blossoms into piles by size. He looked up when Aelith stood. "Are we going to see the loud man again?" "Yes." "Will there be food?" "I will make sure of it," Jorath said. And something about the way he said it, gentle, almost warm, made Aelith study him more carefully. But his face was already turned toward the corridor. The council room was not the great hall. It was smaller, windowless, lit by heavy iron candelabras that threw unsteady light across a long table and the 7 people seated around it. Council elders, all of them, gray-haired and grim-faced, and watching her enter with expressions she could not read. Torvain stood at the head of the table. He was gripping the back of his chair so hard the wood was creaking. When Aelith walked in with Emrys on her hip, his eyes went to the boy first, then to her, and the look on his face nearly stopped her in her tracks. He looked gutted, hollowed out, like someone had reached into his chest and removed something essential. Good, Aelith thought savagely, then immediately hated herself for thinking it. Sit, please, Torvain said, and his voice was rough. Aelith sat. Emrys climbed down from her lap and planted himself on the floor, cross-legged, and went back to sorting invisible chamomile blossoms with his hands. The council stared at him. He ignored them completely. Healer Orla has presented her findings to the council, Torvain began. Each word sounded like it cost him something. The evidence indicates that the original diagnosis was fraudulent, that healer Veda administered a compound to suppress fertility and then documented the results as natural barrenness. He paused. His knuckles were white against the chair. The exile of the Luna was based on false evidence, he continued. The council acknowledges this. Acknowledges, Aelith said. The word tasted like ash. That is what we are calling it? An elder cleared his throat. The council deeply regrets the error in judgment that led to— It was not an error in judgment, Aelith interrupted, and her voice was quiet, but every wolf in the room felt the edge of it. It was a crime. Someone poisoned me, lied about the results, and used those lies to have me thrown out of my home, stripped of my name, and exiled pregnant and alone into territory with no pack protection. That is not an error. That is a crime, and the woman who committed it has conveniently vanished. The silence that followed could have cut stone. Torvain spoke into it. You are right. Aelith looked at him. She had been prepared for arguments, for justification, for the political maneuvering that councils were built to perform. She had not been prepared for him to simply agree with her. You are right, Torvain repeated, and I will spend the rest of my life answering for the part I played in it. But right now, the immediate concern is the boy. His name is Emrys. Emrys. Torvain said the name carefully, like he was learning a word in a language he did not speak. He carries alpha bloodline markers, dominant markers, the strongest healer Orla has ever recorded. Aelith's jaw tightened. She knew where this was going. Pack law requires that a direct line alpha heir be raised within the pack, Jorath said from his position by the door. For the safety of the child and the stability of the bloodline. You want to take my son? Aelith's voice dropped to something lethal. No, Torvain said it immediately, almost desperately. No, that is not what I want. Then what? I want you both to stay. The words landed between them like a stone in still water. Aelith stared at him. He stared back. His expression was open in a way she had never seen during their marriage, raw and unguarded, and she did not know what to do with it. Stay here, she said slowly. In Ashenmere, the place that cast me out. Torvain flinched. I cast you out, he corrected quietly. The pack followed my lead. The responsibility is mine. Emrys looked up from the floor. Mama, what does cast out mean? The room held its breath. Aelith looked down at her son, at his wide gray eyes and open face, and felt the competing forces inside her pull in opposite directions. The part of her that wanted to take Emrys and run as far and as fast as possible, and the part that knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a mother, that her son needed things she could not give him alone. Training, pack, a place where his wolf could grow without having to hide. A father. It means we are going to stay for a while, Aelith said carefully. Just for a while. Will there be food? Emrys asked. Torvain made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Yes, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. There will be food. The council settled the terms quickly after that. Aelith and Emrys would occupy the East Wing chambers. Emrys would begin age-appropriate training with the pack's youth instructor. Aelith would assist healer Orla in the infirmary, the only role that matched her skills and kept her within the keep's walls. Torvain would have supervised access to Emrys at agreed-upon times. Supervised? Torvain asked, and the single word held the weight of a man who understood exactly how little trust remained. Yes, Jorath confirmed. By the boy's mother. Until further notice. Torvain nodded once, accepting the condition without argument, and Aelith watched something shift in his face. Not resentment. Something closer to understanding. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who recognized that this woman was no longer the quiet, accommodating Luna he had married. 5 years of survival had forged someone different, someone harder, and he was seeing her clearly for the first time. As Aelith stood to leave, Emrys walked directly up to the Alpha, who stood nearly 4 feet taller than him. The boy craned his neck all the way back to look up at the man's face. My mama said you have always been loud, Emrys informed him. I am also loud. Would you like to hear? And before anyone could intervene, the boy threw his head back and let out a howl that rattled the candelabras. The first days were unbearable. Aelith existed in a state of constant vigilance, her nerves stretched taut as bowstrings, her eyes tracking every unfamiliar face, every closed door, every shadow in the corridors of a place that had once been her home and now felt like a cage, wrapped in expensive curtains. Emrys, on the other hand, adapted with the terrifying speed of a child who had inherited his father's refusal to be intimidated by anything. By the second day, he had memorized the route from their chambers to the kitchen and developed a strategic alliance with the head cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Greta who had an apparently bottomless tolerance for small boys who appeared at her workstation asking for honey cakes. By the third day, he had named every gargoyle on the East Wing battlements. By the fourth, he had gotten into a shoving match with a boy twice his size in the training yard, and won by simply refusing to stay down. Aelith watched all of this from carefully maintained distances, torn between terror and the reluctant admission that her son was having the time of his life. Torvain came for his supervised visits with the rigid formality of a man attending his own tribunal. He would arrive at the East Wing at the agreed time, stand awkwardly in the doorway, and wait for Aelith's nod before entering. Then he would sit on the floor, because Emrys played on the floor, and try to make conversation with a 4-year-old who had decided this enormous stranger was interesting, but not yet trustworthy. The early attempts were painful to watch. What do you like to do? Torvain asked during the first visit, his voice careful. Emrys considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. I like bugs. Bugs, yes. And also puddles. And the noise a door makes when you open it really fast. Torvain looked at Aelith for help. She offered none. I also like that, Torvain tried valiantly. Doors. Emrys narrowed his eyes. Which door is your favorite? Aelith watched from the corner of the room, arms crossed, face carefully neutral. She would not help him. She would not make this easy. He had earned every second of this discomfort. The second visit went worse. Torvain brought a carved wooden horse, clearly expensive, clearly purchased with care. Emrys examined it for approximately 3 seconds, set it aside, and returned to arranging pebbles he had collected from the training yard into a formation only he understood. Torvain sat holding nothing, looking like a man who had just had a gift returned to him at the door. But something shifted during the second week. Emrys had been building something out of wooden blocks in the corner of their chamber. A tower, elaborate and precarious, that he had been working on for 2 days with the obsessive focus he brought to everything. When Torvain arrived for his visit, Emrys did not look up. He was concentrating too hard, his tongue poking out between his teeth, his small hands trembling with effort as he balanced the final block. Torvain sat down on the floor 3 feet away and watched without speaking. 5 minutes passed in complete silence. Then 10. Aelith waited for him to try to engage, to ask questions, to make awkward conversation. He didn't. He just sat and watched his son build. The tower wobbled. Emrys held his breath. The block settled. Emrys exhaled and sat back with an expression of pure, radiant satisfaction. He turned to look at Torvain. Torvain looked back at him. I built that, Emrys said. You did, Torvain replied. It is very tall. It is the tallest tower in the world. I believe you. Something in Emrys's face relaxed. Not trust, exactly, but the beginning of it, the first crack in the wall. You can add 1 block, Emrys said magnanimously, but only one, and it has to be a good one. Torvin reached for a block with the careful reverence of a man being handed something infinitely fragile. He placed it on top of the tower. It held. Emrys studied it critically. That is acceptable, he pronounced, and Torvain smiled. A real smile, unguarded and warm, that transformed his entire face and made Aelith's chest do something she absolutely refused to acknowledge. She looked away. The small surrenders accumulated after that, quiet as snowfall. A set of new books appeared on the shelf in their chambers. Stories about wolves and adventures and a brave little fox who outsmarted a dragon. Emrys devoured them every night before bed, and Aelith did not ask where they came from, and nobody mentioned it. The fire in their room was always stoked before they returned in the evenings. The wood was always the good kind, the slow-burning oak that held heat through the cold mountain nights, not the cheap pine the East Wing had been stocked with before. Fresh herbs appeared in the infirmary, varieties that Aelith had mentioned in passing to Orla as being difficult to source. Valerian from the northern slopes, moonpetal from the eastern marshes. Ingredients she had gone without for 5 years because they only grew in pack-controlled territory. Where did these come from? Aelith asked Orla, holding up a bundle of dried silverleaf that should have taken weeks to procure. Orla did not look up from her mortar. Delivered this morning. No name on the package. Convenient. Quite. Aelith pressed the silverleaf to her nose and breathed in its clean, sharp scent. She thought about the books on the shelf and the fire in the hearth and the herbs in the infirmary, and she thought about a man who had once been too proud to admit he was wrong about anything, sitting on a cold stone floor watching a 4-year-old build a tower because the 4-year-old had not invited him to do anything else. She did not soften. She refused to soften. But that night, after Emrys had fallen asleep, she heard a sound outside her door. A footstep, then a pause, then another footstep. As if someone had been walking past and stopped, standing in the corridor just outside, listening to the silence on the other side. She pressed her hand flat against the door and held her breath. On the other side, she could hear him breathing. Just breathing. Standing there in the dark, close enough to touch if the wood between them had not existed. Then the footsteps retreated, slow and heavy, and the corridor went silent. Aelith stood at the door for a long time after he was gone. Her hand stayed pressed against the wood. The place where his presence had been felt warm beneath her palm. She pulled her hand back and pressed it against her chest instead, where something she had spent 5 years burying was threatening to surface. Aelith found the room by accident. She had been looking for a supply closet that Orla had described, somewhere on the 3rd floor of the West Wing, containing surplus medical linens that needed sorting. The corridor was unfamiliar, the doors unmarked, and the one she pushed open was not a supply closet. It was an office, small, windowless, lit by a single lantern that someone had left burning, and every wall was covered in maps. Aelith stepped inside, her breath catching as her eyes moved across the room. Maps of territories she recognized, and territories she didn't. Maps with routes drawn in red ink, circles around villages, question marks beside border crossings, pins driven into locations with small notes attached in handwriting she knew as well as her own. Dunmere. That was the first word she recognized, pinned in the eastern lowlands with a red circle around it. Then Greyvale, Thornwick, Lanmere. Places she had passed through in the first desperate year of her exile, before she had settled, before she had found the village that would become her home. He had been searching for her. The realization hit her like cold water. She moved deeper into the room, her fingers trailing across the map nearest the door. The red ink routes were dated. The earliest was marked 4 years ago. The most recent was marked 3 months before her arrival at the border. 4 years. He had been looking for her for 4 years. She opened the ledger on the desk. Pages and pages of correspondence with contacts in distant packs, payments to scouts, descriptions of a woman traveling alone, then a woman traveling with a young child. Physical descriptions of her that were so precise it made her skin prickle. The color of her hair, the scar on her left wrist from a childhood accident, the way she walked, quick and purposeful, like she was always slightly late for something. He remembered how she walked. Aelith closed the ledger and pressed her hands flat against the desk. Her heart was beating too fast. The room smelled faintly of cedar and iron. Torvain's scent soaked into the wood and the paper from hours and hours spent in this chair, at this desk, searching. She should leave. This was not meant for her. This was private, and whatever she felt about Torvain, she had no right to stand in his pain uninvited. But then she saw the letter. It sat apart from the others, unfolded, its edges soft with handling. The paper had been read so many times it was nearly transparent at the creases. She picked it up before she could stop herself. It was addressed to no one. Or rather, it was addressed to her, but it had never been sent. The handwriting was Torvain's, but looser than she remembered. Less controlled, like he had written it in the dark or while his hands were shaking. The first line read, "I do not sleep anymore." She read the rest standing in the lamplight with her hand pressed to her mouth. It was not an apology. It was worse than an apology. It was a confession written to someone he did not expect would ever read it. He wrote about the silence in their chambers after she was gone, about the way the bond had screamed in his chest for months before going quiet in a way that frightened him more than the screaming had. About the nights when his wolf howled with no voice, and the mornings when he could not remember why he had gotten out of bed. He wrote about the growing suspicion that something had been wrong with Veda's diagnosis, how the doubt had started small and grown until it consumed him, how he had confronted Veda before she fled Ashenmere, and she had denied everything, how he had searched her records afterward and found inconsistencies he could not prove, traces of something deliberate that he lacked the medical knowledge to confirm. How the uncertainty had been its own kind of torture, not knowing whether he had exiled his mate for a lie or for a truth, and being unable to determine which would be worse. He wrote, "I broke the only thing that mattered, and I did it with my own hands, and I do not know if I was deceived or simply blind, and I am no longer certain which answer I am more afraid of." Aelith set the letter down. Her eyes were burning. She would not cry. She would not cry for a man who had exiled her pregnant and alone into the wilderness, no matter how many unsent letters he had written in this small, dark room. But then she saw the second thing that should not have been there. A small glass vial on the corner of the desk, half empty, labeled in Orla's careful handwriting. She picked it up and read the label. Stabilization tonic, alpha grade, twice daily. Aelith's blood went cold. She knew this compound. She had mixed variations of it during her training. It was not a supplement. It was not a general health tonic. It was prescribed for one condition, and one condition only: bond deterioration. The severing of a mate bond did not simply cause emotional pain. In severe cases, it attacked the wolf itself, degrading the connection between the human consciousness and the animal spirit. The symptoms progressed in a predictable pattern. Insomnia first, then loss of appetite, loss of focus, loss of physical strength. Then the wolf began to retreat, pulling further and further inward until the shift became painful, then difficult, then impossible. And then the wolf died inside its host. And shortly after, so did the host. Aelith stared at the vial in her hand. Torvain was deteriorating. The broken bond was killing his wolf. The tonic was holding it at bay. But tonics had limits, and the dosage on this vial suggested he was already past the point where moderate intervention would be enough. She did not know how long he had, but she knew, with the cold certainty of a trained healer, that the timeline was not measured in years. The door opened behind her. She turned. Torvain stood in the doorway, and the look on his face when he saw her standing in his private room, holding his unsent letter in one hand and his medication in the other, was the most exposed she had ever seen another living person. Neither of them spoke. Emrys's voice drifted up from somewhere in the corridor below, laughing at something, bright and oblivious and alive, and the sound filled the silence between his parents like light filling a wound. Neither of them moved. Torvain stood in the doorway of his private room, and the look on his face was not anger. It was the expression of a man who had been caught in the middle of something he had never intended anyone to see. Not the maps or the letters or the search routes drawn in red ink across 100 territories. Those were facts. What she had found was worse than facts. She had found the shape of his grief, laid out in corkboards and candlelight and years of silence. Aelith held up the glass vial. "How long?" she asked. Torvain's jaw tightened. "That is not your concern." "How long, Torvain?" The use of his name without a title seemed to strike him physically. He looked away. 2 years. A little more. 2 years of bond deterioration. Aelith's voice was level, clinical, the voice of a healer diagnosing a patient. And the tonic. How often? Twice daily. And the dosage? His silence told her everything. The dosage had been increasing, which meant the deterioration was accelerating, which meant the tonic was losing its ability to hold the damage at bay. "You are dying," Aelith said. The word hung between them. Torvain looked at her, and the absence of denial in his expression made her chest ache in a way she did not want to examine. "Slowly," he said. "There is time." "There is not time." Aelith set the vial down on the desk with a sharp click. "I have treated bond deterioration, Torvain. In the villages, in the borderlands, in places where mates were separated by distance or death. I know what the progression looks like, and I know what the end looks like, and you are closer to the end than you want to admit." He said nothing. "Does Jorath know?" "Jorath knows everything." "Does Emrys know?" The flinch was involuntary. "No, and he will not." Aelith stared at him across the small room, across the maps, and the ledgers, and the evidence of 4 years of searching for a woman he had sent away and then spent every night trying to find. She wanted to be angry. She was angry, but beneath the anger, something else was moving. Something old and stubborn and inconvenient that had survived 5 years of exile without her permission. "The letter," she said. "You suspected Veda was lying. You suspected it before Orla confirmed it." Torvain's face tightened. "I could not prove it. She denied everything when I confronted her, and then she disappeared before I could press further. I had suspicion and nothing else." "You could have told the council." "And said what? That I suspected my own healer had lied?" Without proof, it would have sounded like a guilty man trying to rewrite history to ease his conscience. He met her eyes. "I could not even be certain I was right. All I knew was that something felt wrong, and that I needed to find you, and that every day I failed to do both of those things was another day I deserved to suffer." The rawness in his voice made her look away. She went to Orla the next morning. The healer confirmed what Aelith already knew. "The bond deterioration has progressed beyond what the tonic can manage alone," Orla said. "Proximity to his mate would slow the process significantly. Sustained physical closeness would slow it further." "You are asking me to stay near the man who exiled me. I am telling you the medical facts. What you do with them is your decision." But it was not really a decision at all, because Emrys needed his father alive. Aelith had spent 5 years being everything to her son. She could not also be the person who let his father die when she had the power to prevent it. She told Torvain that evening. "I will take my meals in your dining room," she said, standing in his doorway with her arms crossed. "I will work in the study adjacent to your office during the afternoons. I will be present at your evening council briefings. This is not forgiveness. This is not reconciliation. This is medical intervention." Torvain looked at her for a long moment. "Understood," he said quietly. The proximity began the next day. Meals were stiff, formal affairs at first. Torvain sat at one end of the small dining table, Aelith at the other, Emrys between them chattering about gargoyles and honey cakes and the names he had given every spider in the East Wing corridors. The adults spoke to the child and through the child and around each other, careful never to make direct eye contact for too long. But bodies were not as disciplined as minds. Aelith noticed it within days. The tension in Torvain's shoulders eased when she was in the room. The shadows beneath his eyes softened. He ate more, slept longer, moved with less of the careful stiffness she now recognized as a man managing constant pain. And her own body was responding in ways she could not control. Her wolf, restless and agitated for weeks, settled when she was near him. The migraines that had plagued her since arriving in Ashenmere disappeared. She breathed easier, slept deeper, woke less afraid. She hated noticing. She hated that her body remembered what her mind was trying to forget. One evening, reaching for the salt at the same moment he did, their fingers touched. The contact lasted less than a second. Skin against skin, brief and accidental, and utterly unremarkable, except that the bond flared. It hit her like a wave of heat through her entire body, starting where their fingers met and radiating outward through her chest, her lungs, her spine. She gasped. Across the table, Torvain had gone rigid, his hand frozen in midair, his eyes wide. They stared at each other. The bond hummed between them, alive and desperate and reaching, not dead, not broken, dormant, waiting. And the proximity had woken it up. Emrys looked between his parents. "Why are you both making that face?" Aelith pulled her hand back. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it. "No reason," she managed. But when she looked at Torvain, she knew he had felt it too. And the thing she saw in his eyes was not triumph or satisfaction. It was terror. Because the bond was waking up, and he knew what that meant, and the fear on his face had nothing to do with himself and everything to do with her. 3 days later, Torvain told her to leave. Aelith was in the study when he appeared in the doorway. She knew something was wrong immediately. His face had the closed, locked-down expression she remembered from the day of the decree. The same careful blankness he wore when he was about to do something that would cost him everything. "The proximity arrangement is terminated," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, dead. Aelith set down her pen. "What happened?" "I spoke with Orla this morning. The bond reactivation carries risks I was not aware of." "What risks?" Torvain's jaw worked. "If the bond continues to awaken without being fully restored, the incomplete connection becomes unstable. The deterioration can begin to transfer through it, to you." The words settled over her like cold water. "Transfer," she repeated. "Your wolf would begin to degrade. The same progression, the same outcome." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. "And there is a chance it could affect Emrys through the bloodline. His markers are so dominant, so deeply connected to mine, that Orla cannot guarantee his safety." Aelith went very still. She could see what was happening behind his eyes. The calculus, the terrible arithmetic of a man weighing his own survival against the safety of the two people he had already failed once. "I will not risk you," Torvain said, and his voice cracked on the last word despite every effort to keep it steady. "And I will not risk him. You need to take Emrys and leave Ashenmere, tonight if possible. Torvain, we can complete the bond. That would stop the deterioration entirely and eliminate the transfer risk." No, the refusal was immediate, absolute, and it made no sense. Aelith stared at him. "Why not?" "Because you do not want this bond." His voice was raw. "You did not choose to come back here. You did not choose any of this. And I will not force another thing on you that you did not choose. I have already taken enough from you." The words landed like stones in her chest. Because he was right, partially. She had not chosen to come back. She had not chosen the bond reawakening, but she was choosing to stay. She was choosing to sit across from him at meals and work in the room beside his office, and watch him learn to talk to his son. She was choosing all of it, and he could not see that because the guilt had blinded him to everything except his own unworthiness. "You do not get to make this decision for me," Aelith said, her voice rising. "I am making it for all of us." Torvain stepped back from the doorway. "Jorath will arrange an escort. You leave at first light." "Torvain." "It is done." He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy and deliberate down the stone corridor, and Aelith stood in the empty study with her hands shaking and her wolf howling silently inside her chest. She did not sleep that night. She lay beside Emrys in the dark, listening to his breathing, trying to plan. She could refuse. She could simply stay and dare them to drag her out. But the look on Torvain's face had been the look of a man who had already lost everything once and was choosing to lose it again because he believed losing was safer than risking more damage. And she could not fight a man who was using her own safety as his weapon. The hours crawled past. The fire burned low. The keep settled into the deep silence of a sleeping pack, and Aelith stared at the ceiling and felt the bond pulling in her chest like a fishhook caught on something vital. Sometime past midnight, Emrys began to whimper. Aelith reached for him in the dark, pulling him close, but the whimpering escalated. His small body went rigid against hers. His skin burned hot, then went ice cold in a pattern that made her healer's instincts scream. Emrys. She sat up, pulling him into her lap. Emrys, wake up. His eyes flew open. They were gold, not the warm hazel of a sleepy child, burning, feral gold, and the sound that came out of his throat was not a child's cry. It was a wolf in distress, high and keening and desperate, and it echoed off the stone walls loud enough to bring the guards running. Aelith held her son as he thrashed and cried, his wolf surging beneath his skin, trying to shift and failing, the incomplete bond to his father pulling, and finding nothing on the other end. "Mama," Emrys gasped between sobs. "Mama, something is wrong. Something is missing. I can feel it and it hurts." Aelith pressed her forehead to his and squeezed her eyes shut. The separation was not protecting her son. It was tearing him apart. By morning, Emrys was quiet but fragile. He sat on the bed with hollow eyes and would not eat, and when Aelith tried to carry him to the infirmary, he clung to her neck and whispered, "Do not take me away from here. The pulling is worse when we move." The pulling. Aelith's stomach turned. Her 4-year-old son was feeling the bond strain, the physical agony of an incomplete connection being stretched beyond its tolerance. He should not have been able to feel it at all. Children were supposed to be shielded from bond dynamics until maturity, but Emrys was not a normal child. His wolf had presented dominant alpha markers before his 5th birthday. His sensitivity to the bond was exponentially higher than any healer's textbook accounted for. She found Orla in the infirmary and told her everything. The healer's face went gray. "The boy is feeling it," Orla said. It was not a question. His wolf tried to emerge in the night. He could not shift, could not settle, could not stop the pain. Aelith's voice was steady only because she had spent 5 years learning how to hold herself together when everything was falling apart. "You told Torvain the proximity was a risk. Did you tell him it was a risk to Emrys specifically?" Orla hesitated. "I told him the incomplete bond posed theoretical risks. I did not anticipate this severity. The child's connection to his father is unusually deep, unusually active for his age. So the separation is not protecting Emrys, it is destroying him." "It is worse than that," Orla said, and her voice dropped. "What I told the Alpha was true. An incomplete bond that has been reawakened and then severed is far more dangerous than a bond that was simply broken." The reactivation opened the channel. The abrupt separation turned that channel into a wound. Proximity alone carried the risk of slow transfer, but reigniting the bond and then cutting contact is catastrophically worse than either option on its own. It has sent all 3 of your wolves into a death spiral. Aelith closed her eyes. She could feel it now, through the incomplete bond, a distant but unmistakable sensation of something enormous and powerful folding in on itself, like a structure collapsing from within. Torvain's wolf. Dying. "What about Torvain?" she managed. Orla was quiet for a moment too long. "Orla. The Alpha collapsed this morning," Orla said. "In the council chamber, in front of the entire advisory board. He was mid-sentence when his legs gave out. Jorith caught him before he hit the floor, but the damage was visible to everyone present. The council knows now. The whole pack will know by evening." The floor seemed to shift beneath Aelith's feet. She gripped the edge of the workbench and forced herself to breathe. "His wolf is failing," Orla continued. "The reactivation and then the abrupt separation accelerated the deterioration dramatically. What should have taken months has compressed into days. There is no more time for politics or pride or protection," Aelith said, and her voice sounded strange in her own ears, hard and bright and close to breaking. Orla met her gaze. The bond must be fully restored. There is no alternative. If the alpha dies, the boy, carrying his father's dominant markers, sharing his father's bond frequency, will follow. His wolf will consume itself trying to maintain a connection that no longer exists on the other end. He is 4 years old, Aelith. He does not have the reserves to survive it. The room went very quiet. Somewhere in the keep above them, her son was sitting on a bed with hollow eyes, feeling the phantom pain of a bond that nobody had given him a choice about. And somewhere else in this building, his father was lying unconscious because he had decided that dying was preferable to risking another mistake. And between them, Aelith stood with the only decision that mattered. She did not hesitate. "Take me to him," she said. Orla led her through the corridors at a pace that was just short of running. Guards stepped aside without question. Jorith met them at the door to the Alpha's chambers with a face like carved stone. "He ordered me not to let you in," Jorith said. "I know. He specifically said you would come, and that I should turn you away. I know." Jorith studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "He also told me," Jorith added quietly, "that if you insisted, I should let you pass, because he has never once been able to stop you from doing what you believed was right." Aelith pushed through the door. The room was dark. The fire had burned low, and Torvain lay on his bed, barely conscious, his skin ashen, his breathing shallow and labored and wrong. He looked diminished in a way she had never seen, the broad shoulders thinner, the powerful frame collapsed in on itself, as though something essential had been pulled out of him and the rest was slowly following. She crossed the room in 3 strides and sat on the edge of the bed beside him. His eyes opened, unfocused, struggling to find her face. "I told you to leave," he whispered. "And I told you that you do not get to make this decision for me." Aelith took his hand. His fingers were cold, too cold. "Your son cannot sleep. Your son is in pain. Your son is 4 years old and he is being torn apart by a bond he did not choose, and you are lying here choosing to die rather than let me help you." Torvain's eyes closed. "If I hurt you again—" "You are hurting me right now," Aelith said, and her voice broke. "You are hurting all 3 of us right now, because you have decided that your guilt matters more than your son's life." The words cut through the room like a blade through silk. Torvain flinched. His hand tightened around hers. "Emrys," he whispered, "is he—" "He is afraid and in pain, and he does not understand why." Aelith leaned closer. "But he is alive, and he is going to stay alive, because I am going to fix this whether you help me or not." Torvain was quiet for a long time. Aelith could feel his pulse through his fingers, weak and irregular, the heartbeat of a man whose body was losing a war it could not win alone. "Tell me about him," Torvain said finally, and his voice was barely audible. "Tell me about my son, the things I missed." Aelith had been bracing for resistance. She had been ready for arguments, for refusal, for the stubborn, maddening pride that had defined this man since the day she first met him. She had not been ready for this. A dying man asking about the child he had never known. She gripped his hand tighter and began. "He was born in a room above a bakery," she said, "in a village called Thurnsfield, population 212. The midwife was 60 years old with hands like leather and a voice like a foghorn, and she told me I was the loudest woman she had ever delivered." Torvain's mouth twitched, the ghost of something that might have been a smile. "He came into the world screaming," Aelith continued, "furious about the entire experience. He did not stop crying for 3 hours, and when he finally did, he opened his eyes and looked at me, and they were gray." Her voice wavered. "You're gray, and I knew. I knew right then that I would never be able to outrun you, because you were looking at me through his face." Torvain made a sound in his throat, rough and broken. "He walked at 9 months. Early. Too early. He walked straight into a table and knocked out a tooth that had not even finished growing in, and he did not cry. He just looked at the table like it had personally offended him." She laughed, a wet, unsteady sound. "He gets that from you. The stubbornness, the refusal to acknowledge that anything has hurt him." Torvain closed his eyes. A tear slid down his temple into the pillow. "What else?" He is afraid of absolutely nothing, Aelith said, except silence. He does not like silence. If a room is too quiet, he fills it. With words, with humming, with questions that have no answers. He once asked me why the moon does not fall, and when I tried to explain, he told me I was wrong and that the moon stays up because it is stubborn. She paused. Like I said, he gets things from you. Torvain's fingers tightened around hers. The first winter was hard, she said, and her voice changed, quieter, stripped of the warmth that had carried the earlier memories. I had no money. I had no pack. I had no one. I delivered him alone, Torvain. The midwife came, but she was late, and for the first hour, it was just me in that room, and I was so afraid. His eyes opened. The devastation in them was absolute. There were nights I could not keep the fire burning, she continued. Nights when I held him against my chest under every blanket I owned and prayed that my body heat would be enough. Nights when I thought about coming back and asking for help, and then remembered that there was nothing to come back to. Aelith, he whispered, and her name sounded like a wound. But I survived, she said fiercely. And he survived, and he grew, and he laughed, and he built towers out of everything he could find, and he asked about his father every single night. Torvain's face crumpled. Every night, Aelith said, and the tears were falling now, running down her face unchecked. Every single night before he sleeps, he asks me, "Where is my father? Why does he not come? Is he looking for me?" And I tell him yes. I tell him his father is out there somewhere, looking and looking, because I could not bear to tell him the truth. And what is the truth? Torvain asked, and his voice was wrecked. The truth is that his father has been in this keep the whole time, searching for us with one hand and punishing himself with the other, and I am so tired of watching you choose the punishment. The silence that followed was enormous. Torvain looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not the Alpha of Ashenmere. It was not the man who had stood in that courtyard and read the decree that destroyed her life. It was something underneath all of that, something raw and young and terrified. A man who had made the worst mistake of his life and spent 5 years building a prison out of it. I do not know how to deserve this, he said. You do not have to deserve it, Aelith replied. You just have to accept it. She placed her free hand against his chest, over his heart. She could feel his wolf beneath the surface, faint and struggling and barely there. She closed her eyes and reached for the bond, the dormant thread that connected them, the thing that had survived exile and distance and years of silence. It was there, thin as spider silk, fragile as breath, but alive. She pulled. The bond responded. She felt it stir, felt it reach for Torvain's wolf with desperate, starving urgency. The connection brightened. Warmth flooded through her chest, her arms, her fingertips. She could feel him, truly feel him for the first time in 5 years, and the sensation was so overwhelming she nearly lost her breath. Torvain gasped. His back arched off the bed. His hand crushed hers. Stay with me, Aelith whispered. Stay, right here. The bond reached deeper. She could feel his wolf now, feel the damage, the hollowed-out places where the connection had been severed, the wounds that had never healed. She pushed further, pouring everything she had into the thread, trying to bridge the gap. And then the thread snapped taut. Something was wrong. The bond was reaching but could not connect, like trying to grasp a hand in the dark and closing on empty air. Torvain's wolf was too far gone, too deep in the collapse, and the bond could not find it. Torvain's body went rigid, his eyes rolled back, his hand went limp in hers. No, Aelith grabbed his shoulders. No, no, no. Torvain, stay with me. But he was gone. His body was there, breathing shallowly, heart still beating, but the man behind his eyes had vanished. His wolf had retreated to a place the bond could not reach. Aelith felt the pull then, deep in her chest, beneath her ribs, in the place where the bond lived. A downward current, dragging her toward the place where his wolf had gone, not outward, inward, into the bond itself. She could resist it. She could pull back, stay in the physical world, call for Orla, try to stabilize him with tonics and herbs and hope, or she could follow him, Aelith closed her eyes and let go. She opened her eyes to a world made of ash. Ashenmere stretched before her, but wrong. The walls were crumbling, the towers listing at broken angles against a sky the color of old bone. No fires burned in the windows, no voices echoed in the courtyards. The keep was empty, gutted, abandoned, as if every living thing had left a long time ago and taken the warmth with them. The air tasted like grief. Aelith walked forward through the silent courtyard, her bare feet on cold stone that should have been familiar but felt like the surface of a dead world. She knew where she was. Not the physical Ashenmere, but the Ashenmere that lived inside Torvain's mind, the one his guilt had been building, stone by stone, for 5 years. This was what he saw when he looked at his home. Ruin, emptiness, a monument to failure. She found the wolf in the great hall. He lay on the stone floor beneath the shattered remnants of the Alpha's chair, enormous and black-furred with the silver slash across his chest and the dark ridge along his spine. The same markings that lived on Emrys's tiny pup form. But where Emrys's wolf had burned with fierce, defiant life, this wolf was dying. His ribs showed through his coat. His breathing was shallow and uneven. His golden eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Around him, the hall was full of echoes. Not ghosts, not figures with faces. Echoes. The same scene playing on an endless loop in the shadows along the walls. A woman standing before a crowd while a man read a decree. A woman walking through gates, alone. A woman disappearing into the distance while hundreds of wolves watched in silence. Her. He was watching her exile on repeat. His wolf was lying on the floor of a ruined hall, watching the most unforgivable thing he had ever done play over and over in the dark, and he was not fighting it. He was not trying to stop it or look away or escape. He was watching because he believed he should. Aelith knelt beside the wolf. He did not react to her presence. His golden eyes stayed fixed on the shadows, on the echo of her walking away. "Torvain," she said softly, "I am here." The wolf's ear twitched. Nothing more. She reached out and placed her hand on his side. His fur was cold, unnaturally cold, like touching stone. The ribs beneath her fingers were sharp and prominent. This wolf had been starving itself, refusing to heal, refusing to live. "I know what you are doing," Aelith said. "I know you think watching this is what you deserve. I know you think staying here is the right thing because you sent me away, and you believe the punishment should fit the crime." The wolf's breathing hitched. "But you are wrong. Not about the crime. You did send me away. You believed a lie, and you did not fight for me, and I walked through those gates carrying your child, and you did not stop it." Her voice was steady and fierce and cracking at the edges. "That happened. I will not pretend it didn't. I will not tell you it was all right, because it was not." The echoes on the walls flickered. The shadow Aelith paused at the gates. "But I need to tell you something you have not seen." Aelith leaned closer to the wolf, her hand pressed flat against his cold fur. "I need to tell you what happened after I walked through those gates. Because you have been watching me leave for 5 years, but you never saw what came next." The wolf's golden eyes shifted. For the first time, they moved from the shadows to her face. "I survived," Aelith whispered. "I walked for 6 days. I slept in ditches and ate what I could find, and I survived. I reached Thurnsfield with nothing, and a midwife took me in because I was pregnant and alone, and she was kind. And 4 months later, I gave birth to your son in a room above a bakery, and he screamed so loudly the whole street heard him." The wolf lifted its head, just barely. "Just enough. He has your eyes," Aelith continued, tears falling freely. "He has your jaw and your stubbornness and your refusal to stay down when someone pushes him. He builds towers and names gargoyles, and he bit a patrol captain on his first shift because someone grabbed my arm too hard." The wolf's ears came forward. "He howled in your council chamber. He told you that you have his face. He let you put 1 block on his tower." Aelith's voice broke. "He is out there right now, in pain, because the bond to you is tearing him apart, and he does not understand why. He is 4 years old and he needs his father, and his father is lying on a cold floor choosing to die. The wolf made a sound, low, anguished, a whine that vibrated through the stone beneath them. The echoes on the walls shattered like glass. I did not come back here for you, Aelith said, and the truth of it burned through her chest. I came back because a boy shifted at a border checkpoint, and everything I built came undone. But I am choosing to stay. I am choosing you. Not because you have earned it, and not because I have forgotten. Because our son needs both of us, and because I am tired of building towers alone. She extended her hand, palm up, in front of the wolf's muzzle. Get up, she said. Get up, Torvain. Come home. The wolf stared at her hand. The golden eyes, dim and nearly extinguished, flickered. Then, slowly, painfully, with the effort of a creature pulling itself out of its own grave, the wolf pressed its muzzle into her palm. Warmth exploded through her. The bond ignited like a fire catching dry wood, blazing outward from the point of contact through every fiber of her being. She felt it lock into place, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, complete and overwhelming and irreversible. Her wolf surged forward to meet his, and the two spirits crashed together in the space between them, with a force that shook the ruined hall to its foundations. The walls of the dead Ashenmere crumbled. Light poured through the cracks, golden and warm and alive, and the world dissolved around her. She opened her eyes in his chambers. The fire was burning. Dawn light pressed against the windows. Torvain lay beside her, breathing deeply, steadily, peacefully. Color had returned to his face. His hand was wrapped around hers, warm and solid and alive. And on the other side of the bed, curled between them with one small hand gripping his father's sleeve and the other tangled in his mother's hair, Emrys slept. His face was calm. His breathing was even. No pain, no distress, no pulling. He had found his way here in the dark, drawn by the bond, drawn by the thing that connected all three of them, and he had crawled into the space between his parents and fallen asleep like he had always belonged there. Aelith looked at her son, looked at the man beside her, felt the bond humming in her chest, golden and warm and whole. She closed her eyes and let go of 5 years of holding on. The bond did not fix everything. There was no magic that could undo 5 years of exile in a single night. No restored connection that could erase the memory of giving birth alone in a cold room, of raising a child in hiding and fear, of learning to carry everything because there was no one to share the weight. Those things had happened, and they lived in Aelith's body, the way old injuries live in bones. Quiet most days, but present always. But Torvain understood that. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not assume the restored bond meant the past was erased. He simply showed up. Every morning he showed up. He learned how Emrys liked his eggs. He learned which stories made the boy laugh and which ones made him ask impossible questions that no adult could answer satisfactorily. He learned that Emrys could not sleep without the window cracked open, even in winter, and that he counted gargoyles when he was nervous, and that the fastest way to earn his trust was to sit quietly and wait to be invited. The investigation into Veda's conspiracy moved quickly once the full weight of the Alpha's authority was behind it. Orla's forensic review of the old medical records traced the fertility suppressant to a compound that required rare ingredients that only a council member with access to the Pack's trade routes could have procured. Elder Fenwick confessed within a week of being confronted with the evidence. He had wanted the Alpha line to end. He had wanted his own family elevated. Veda had been his instrument. His removal from the council was swift and public, and Aelith watched from the gallery without satisfaction or triumph. Justice was not a feeling, it was a correction. Her name was restored at a formal ceremony she did not ask for and did not particularly want. The title of Luna settled back onto her shoulders like a coat she had outgrown. She wore it differently now, less carefully. With the quiet authority of a woman who had survived losing everything and learned that she did not need a title to know her own worth. Emrys thrived in ways that surprised everyone except his mother. His training progressed rapidly, his wolf growing stronger and more disciplined with each passing month. He built towers everywhere, in the training yard, in the kitchen, in the council chamber when no one was watching. Torvain added one block each time and waited to be told whether it was acceptable. It usually was. On a morning in late autumn, Aelith stood in the courtyard where her life had once ended and begun again. The stone beneath her feet was the same. The walls were the same. The gates through which she had once walked stood open to a valley painted gold and copper by the turning leaves. Emrys was chasing something across the grass, a bug or a leaf or an imagined enemy only he could see, his laughter rising into the cool air like smoke. Torvain appeared beside her. He did not touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the steady hum of the bond between them. "He is going to knock over that lantern," Torvain observed. "Yes. Should I stop him?" "No. Let him knock it over. He will learn." They stood together in the courtyard and watched their son run, and the gates were open, and neither of them was walking through.